Although this may look like, and in fact is, a Scion XB, this is not a Scion XB. It's an eBox from AC Propulsion. It's an electric car from 2008, and the technology in this thing is extremely impressive. And I don't just mean impressive for an electric car from 15 years ago. It's impressive for an electric car today. This thing has technology in it that electric cars are just now starting to come out with. And this is a pile of rusty nails and a railroad spike I just found on the ground. What? Yeah. Oh my God! Okay, that was 50. That was not 60, but I got a little scared because I'm in a parking lot, not on the road. First of all, if you're not from North America, Scion was a sub-brand of Toyota marketed entirely in North America and targeted squarely at the youths. The Scion XB, the first generation form, was just a rebranded Toyota BB from Japan. And as a brand, Scion was so incredibly successful that in 2016, Toyota killed it off entirely. But like I said, this is no longer a Scion XB. AC Propulsion took a Scion XB and upfitted it into their own electric car, and they called it the eBox. See what they did there? They took X and B, flipped them, and added 2 more letters. And an electric badge. Look at this terrible exhaust port plug. It doesn't even match the contour of the bumper. AC Propulsion started out in the early 90s developing AC induction motors and controllers for those motors. The company, or at least some people from the company, had a hand in developing the drivetrain for the infamous GM EV1. Then in the early 2000s, they made their own electric sports car called the T0 that supposedly went on to inspire the original Tesla Roadster. Gone is the original 1.5-liter 4-cylinder that originally powered this car, and in its place is an asynchronous AC induction motor developed in-house by ACP. The original Toyota engine in this car made about 108 horsepower. The new electric motor that's put in its place makes 150 kilowatts. That's 200 horsepower. Apparently the 0 to 60 time of this car when it was new is 7 seconds in a front-wheel drive car. This big gold box here on top is the inverter and charger for the car, and the lid is upside down. With the lid off and all the danger bits exposed, you can see the inner workings. Up here is some AC capacitors, some fuses, lots of things that are very dangerous to touch, and some low voltage components, and then this hinges up, and underneath you can see the inverters. This is for each phase of the motor, and I believe that's the DC to DC converter componentry over there. And this whole box is air-cooled by a little fan that you probably can't see down here. Just blows in underneath the circuitry on the bottom. The accessories in this car, the air conditioner, the power steering, are still belt-driven, but because there's no engine to drive them, they just fitted it with a small electric motor to drive the accessories. So anytime the key is on, you can hear that little motor whirring underneath the hood driving the accessories. Fortunately, the air conditioner in this car doesn't work, but the power steering does, so that's good. The power from that motor is still being delivered to the wheels through the original manual transmission that originally came equipped in this car, but that transmission is locked in second gear, the gear lever has been removed, and so has the clutch pedal. Because this is technically a manual transmission car, there is no park gear, you just have to use the handbrake lever like it's a manual transmission car, and I can just pop the little shifter into drive and take off. Rather quickly. The charge point is up here in the grille. It's a J1772, but that's not what originally came equipped with the car. Originally, it came equipped with some sort of proprietary connector because this car was built before the J1772 was standardized. Okay, we're at 45, 50s, 55, 60, 65, 70. Starts to lose a little bit of momentum up at higher speeds. We're doing 80. Things are starting to vibrate. 85. I think 90 is all it has in it. And obviously, I'm on a test track. It's a closed course, and it's perfectly legal to do that here because it's private property. I'm not lying, I swear. Look, it's a different one. This one was not upfitted by AC Propulsion in California. Instead, this one was upfitted by Autoport in Delaware, but it's still the same car. By the way, if you're wondering what's behind the fuel door now, it's dirt and a hole. It's a dirty hole. There's a lot of backlash, probably because this is a manual transmission. There's a lot of backlash in the drivetrain. So going back and forth between drive forward and regen, there's a lot of slop and it tends to judder around quite a lot. It's actually hilarious. The battery pack. Part of the battery pack sits underneath the front seats. It's fairly obvious where they are underneath there because of the badly done carpeting around them, and the other part of the pack sits underneath the back seats. It's made up of 18650 lithium cells. It has 35 kilowatt hours worth of energy storage, which gives this car a range of, the proprietors of this car tell me that it'll do 100 miles easily, about 120 miles if you push it, and AC Propulsion's claim of 160 miles of range was pure fantasy. And remember, this is from 2008. 35 kilowatt hours and 100 miles of range is super impressive. Compare that to the original Nissan Leaf, which came out several years after the eBox. This only has a 24 kilowatt hour battery pack, 11 less than the eBox. The driving range on this is only 73 miles, according to the EPA. Although according to the car, it's only 44 miles, so oof. But similar to the eBox, the battery pack in this is also not actively cooled. So the battery cells get hot, they just stay that way for a while. And it's ugly. It's not relevant, but this is an ugly car. It's not the most refined driving software. It's quite easy to get this car into a state under regen when it's sort of oscillating. Let's see if I can do it. Yeah. Woo! This is the power hub. This is the DC output. It's configurable to 12 or 24 volts, and it's capable of up to 1.6 kilowatts of output. And this is the AC output. You can get 3.6 kilowatts of output from the onboard inverter. That's enough to run this disgusting toaster oven and this vacuum, and still have over a kilowatt of power left over to spare. Or a more realistic example, you could have a stove, a microwave, and an air conditioner all running at the same time. This little light I have hooked up here, it only draws 3 watts, so maybe it's not the best demonstration. This is the AC input, up to 3 kilowatts for shore power, and input for up to 3 battery packs. This is the one 5 kilowatt hour lithium iron phosphate battery pack I have the system configured with now. The system is configurable with as little as 2 kilowatt hours or as much as 15, and lithium iron phosphate is an incredibly stable battery chemistry, so this will last you a very, very long time. And there's input for up to 3 solar panel arrays with up to 1600 watts of input, or 2 solar panel arrays and input from an alternator up to 1000 watts. Right now I have 4 solar panels sitting on the other side of this door collecting power from the sun. This is the AC and DC distribution panel. There's up to 6 AC circuits, each with its own breaker, and up to 12 DC circuits, each with its own fuse. And these first 6 circuits are smart connected, so you can control them from either the console screen or the EcoFlow app. And this is the main console screen. It's incredibly configurable, incredibly easy to use, and incredibly responsive. And it has Wi-Fi, so you can do all of this from your phone too, through the EcoFlow app. All of this is part of EcoFlow's new power kit, a complete, integrated, easy to set up, totally modular off-grid power system from EcoFlow that you can use to power your van, motorhome, job site trailer, boat, off-grid cabin, or whatever you want to put this into. I'm going to be using this to power the insides of my bus once it has more than 2 walls. Oh, ad's done. Thanks to EcoFlow for sponsoring this video. If you want to check out the power kit for yourself, there'll be a link in the description below this video. Now back to the Scion Xbox. That's not what it was called. But the most impressive thing about the eBox, and the reason the University of Delaware has a small fleet of them to play around with, is the charging. I know that doesn't sound interesting, but I promise it is. This car does not have a separate charge box. Instead, this motor controller, the inverter, doubles as the charger for this car, and it's capable of 20 kilowatts of AC charging. To put that in perspective, if that number doesn't mean anything to you, my Polestar 2, a car that came out just a year ago, can only AC charge at 11 kilowatts, and the Toyota BZ4X that came out this year can only AC charge at 6 kilowatts. 20 kilowatts is a lot, which means this car, if you can find an 80 amp receptacle to plug into, can charge from 0 to full in just 2 hours, which in a time before the DC rapid charging infrastructure existed at all, is incredibly impressive. But there's more, because this charge box is already the motor inverter. It's outputting 3-phase AC sine waves to the motor to drive it. Some engineer at some point thought, hey, why don't we just take one of those sine waves and output it through the charge port so we can export AC power out of the car into the grid. This vehicle has vehicle to grid and vehicle to load, so it can output 240 volts through the charge port at up to 80 amps. That's 20 kilowatts, nearly 20 kilowatts. To put that in perspective, the F-150 Lightning also has vehicle to load, and it can output 240 volts, but it can only output up to 9.6 kilowatts. This can output 20 kilowatts, and it was made in 2008. For a little demonstration of vehicle to load, I've got a standard J1772 connector here that I'm going to plug into the front. And on the other end of this cable is just a standard NEMA 1450 plug. If I were to touch this right now, since it's bare, I would be dead. And if I was alive enough to realize how dead I was, that would make me very unhappy, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to plug it into an adapter, which just takes the male and turns it into male, so that I can plug in the charger for my Polestar. And all I have to do is go into the eBox's little pod here, set it to 240 volts, and there's a low, and then hit start. Now I can plug in my Polestar, and just like that, I'm charging my Polestar from a Scion XB's nose, and it can export power to the grid, which again is why the University of Delaware has a small fleet of these things to play around with. One little interesting fact about the eBox, and it's the thing that's probably quoted the most, is the first owner of one was Tom Hanks. And apparently Tom Hanks had a little special edition fitted to his eBox so that he could more easily show off the technology. He had it fitted with an automatic transmission lever that didn't do anything with the gearbox. All it did was, it was a potentiometer to adjust the regen braking. In the rest of the cars, it's just this little slider on the dash, but he wanted it in the middle of the car so that he could demonstrate regen braking to passengers. So he could start it out on 0, get up to speed, let off the throttle, and it would coast, and then he could just slide it down with his big shifter and regen brake without touching the brake pedal. And I have to imagine, especially in 2008, before electric cars were, common knowledge, that would be pretty impressive to show to people, especially with how incredibly strong the regen braking is in this car. Unfortunately, the interior is, well, you can tell where all the development effort went because this is a Scion XB with some bits added on. If you've never seen the inside of a Scion XB, here it is. It's a basic economy car with a cavernous dash and one gauge, a speedometer. The tiny little gauge pod has been modified slightly. They've added an amperage charge and discharge meter and a cheeky little fuel gauge. Down here in the center console, where the manual transmission shifter would be, is this little pod that says eBox and has a knob to control the gauge pod over the steering wheel column. It clicks and it spins, and that is it. There's a tiny little LED right here that indicates, as the sticker says, when the brake light's on, because the brake lights activate when you do regen braking. And speaking of regen braking, there's a slider right here to adjust how much regen you get. It goes all the way from 0 to rip your face off. It is very aggressive regenerative braking in this thing. I've got a gauge cluster in front of me so I can tell how much power it's putting back into the battery. So let's go up. Speed. Well, first of all, that's 90 kilowatts there. Regen max, 42 kilowatts of regen braking on max here is what I got up to just then in that little bitty test. I asked, and no, that traction control button does not do anything, but supposedly everything else in this car works, except for the air conditioner. This is the only eBox fitted with cruise control, and I'm thankful for that because this is the worst implementation of cruise control I've ever seen. It has nothing to do with the speed that you're setting with, your foot on the throttle pedal. You set the speed of the cruise control with this knob that is completely independent from the throttle pedal. Why? Nice little eBox sticker over where the Scion badge would be on the steering wheel, and the gauge pod. This is where everything happens. As you can see right now, it says I have 90% state of charge. That's the trip meter. This is the main screen that it brings you to. There's a lot going on here. The speedometer is the important thing, but all this other stuff while you're driving, that's too much. Then you have this screen, which shows you how much power you're drawing or regenerating, another tripometer, and another tripometer. That's basically it. You could also go into settings by holding the thing down, and you can turn on UPS mode, which is vehicle to grid. You can get details about the cells from the BMS. Like cell number 11 is apparently at 3.94 volts right now. And to set the charging limit on this car, you don't set it to a state of charge limit. You set the charge voltage limitation per cell. Right now it's set at, I think, 3.9 volts, which charges it up to about 92% to prolong the lifespan of the battery pack. You don't set the state of charge meter. You set the voltage to charge to for each individual cell. And I'm told from the proprietors of this car that that state of charge meter is not all that accurate. It kind of bounces all over the place, like the state of charge meter on a lead acid powered car. But this is not a lead acid battery pack, it's lithium. They just didn't make a very good charge readout for state of charge percentage. I just noticed that the gauge pod in front of me and the speedometer up there on the dash are 5 miles an hour apart. That is disconcerting. That says I'm going 60. This says I'm going 55. What's my actual speed? I don't know. To change gears, since you notice there is no gear shifter anymore, you use this tiny little nubbin. Drive, reverse, neutral. That's it. Can I put it in neutral while driving? Let's try this. Yes! Scary. Put it back in drive. Okay. On the radio, instead of saying Scion right here, there's an eBox sticker. These cars were fitted with air conditioning, which is driven by an auxiliary motor. It doesn't work in this car, but it does have it. And the heater is a resistive electric heater. It'll drain the crap out of your battery, but it'll keep you warm. This isn't a complaint about the eBox and its technology and its drivetrain or anything. It's more a complaint about the XB. The driving position in this is awful. I'm sitting way up high. The steering wheel is basically below me. I'm looking down. The dash is way up there. I hate it. While these eBoxes were definitely an interesting showcase of technology, and they gave a little sneak peek as to what was to come for the future of EVs, they have like no mass market appeal at all. First of all, there's the knowledge you had to have to operate one of these things. The gauge pod makes no attempt to dumb down anything, so you better know what amps, volts, and kilowatts all mean and how they correlate together. And if you plug this thing into charge, before this had the 1772 connector on it, you had to know the amperage capacity of whatever circuit you're plugging into and then set that in the gauge pod. Otherwise, it's going to shoot right past the amperage capacity of whatever circuit you're plugging into, and best case scenario, you're just going to trip a breaker. But worst case scenario, you're going to start a fire. Then there's the build quality. It's very prototypey, even though it was being sold as kind of a production car, which it definitely is not. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not badly made. It's very well made, but it's batch fabricated, not mass produced. There's a big difference. Then there's the price, which I haven't told you yet. The Scion XB was a cheap car. I'm told when new they cost around $10,000. But ACP charged, according to Wikipedia, $55,000 for the conversion, on top of the purchase price of a Scion XB that you had to buy for them, or pay for them to get. So that's plus or minus $65,000 for a plasticky, cheap, box-shaped economy car that's much quieter and faster than most economy cars, but also more inconvenient to own. It's a really good proposition. So that's the ACP eBox, a showcase of technology built in the shell of a box-shaped economy car that was way ahead of its time. This battery technology especially wouldn't be seen again until shortly after in the Tesla Roadster, but it wouldn't be put into mass production until the Tesla Model S. From there on, electric cars have just taken over. And the motor in this thing was way ahead of its time. Like I said, the motor in this thing was developed in the 90s. And here it is being shoved into an economy car in 2008 and overpowering the crap out of it. This is a very interesting car. Even if it doesn't make much sense to sell, I'm glad it exists. And it pushed the technology forward just that little bit. There's a train going behind me. Can't see it. Anyway, thank you to the fine people at the University of Delaware for inviting me to take a look at their small collection of ACP eBoxes and another sneak peek at another car that they have that I'll only be sharing on Patreon. And thanks as always to my generous, supportful patrons. See the names scrolling by. See you next time.